From the Toronto Star, I'm Reggie Mudler, and this matters. Education is a passport for the future, for tomorrow belongs to the people who prepare for it today. That's something that Malcolm X said, and it remains excellent advice. Yesterday, the Ontario government announced the rest of their schools reopening plan for the province. And while this was the news that many parents were waiting for, there are still a number of questions as to why the government feels this is a good time for students to return, and also about what happens if case transmissions rise, or if one of the new, more contagious variants causes an outbreak in a school. Kris Rushowy is a Queen's Park reporter for The Star, and prior to that was an education reporter. She joins us to talk about the government's decision to reopen schools across the province. Kris, I know how busy you are. I want to thank you so much for making the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Kris, if you're a parent, this was the news that you've been waiting for, but just in case that you were stuck in the fog of working from home with a child and missed it, let's just recap what the Minister of Education and the Chief Medical Officer, David Williams, announced yesterday. Who's going back and when?
Yeah, so that was the news all parents were waiting to hear. So what happened is the province announced yesterday that, so boards in Toronto, Peel, York, will be going back after Family Day. They've decided to wait almost another 2-week cycle just to see where the numbers go. Everywhere else, that's where kids are learning online, those kids are going to be back at school on Monday. So that's Durham, Halton, Niagara, most of Southern Ontario. Everybody else is back. Northern Ontario schools went back on January the 11th. And then this past Monday, we saw Eastern Ontario and a bit of Southwestern Ontario. Those kids returned as well. So by the day after Family Day, all kids should be back in school, in person, in class.
I love my daughter. I can't wait till she goes back.
Okay, I have 3 at home, so.
I know you understand this. And I know that everybody you know is calling you and asking you what is going on. What's new this time around?
What the medical community has advised me is it's not one action to the exclusion of others. It has to be a suite of comprehensive actions: improving air ventilation, providing PPE, mandating masking, the cohorting of students, the staggered starts of class and bus times. All of this, when you aggregate it, when you put it together, it's a plan that has allowed us to the present. And our intention with the new layers of prevention, with the new investments, the additional $381 million, of which $65 million can be used in part for staffing, to hire more teachers, more staff to keep these kids safe. And we'll continue to do that, continue to be informed by the science, and we'll continue to act.
That's what parents are asking. They're saying, what are my kids going back to? What's different? The teacher unions have been asking the same thing. So the education minister noted yesterday that some money has been given for better ventilation, so for portable air filters, for better masking for kids, for teachers. There's more money for hiring and other things like that. There's more money for testing. They're supposed to be ramping up an asymptomatic surveillance program. It's not up and running. So I think when kids go back, they're not going to notice a lot different. A lot of boards were already mandating masks from grade 1 and up. So now everybody has to do it. Toronto was doing it, for example. Kids have to have masks when they're outdoors. Some boards were doing it, some weren't. Now they're going to have to. So they'll notice things like that. But I think the one thing that I keep hearing from teachers and from parents is the issue of physical distancing, which we haven't heard a lot about because it means smaller classes. And that's the one thing that I don't think parents won't notice. The classes aren't that much smaller than they were before this lockdown. That's sort of the sticking point for a lot of parents who are concerned about sending their kids back to school. Now, that said, I have spoken to parents and students who are very happy to go back. They don't have concerns. Even with a new variant, they think all the things that are in place are enough. And they will point to what happened in the fall and early winter before the lockdown, that transmission in schools wasn't a huge concern for many.
Okay, the other thing that I'm a little bit confused about is that the government didn't really spell out sort of a framework or a rationale for this decision. I mean, there's some mention of some thresholds, but it's not clear. Is there a number that if we hit, they're shutting down schools again? Do we know anything like that?
We've been asking to get that number, and I'm not sure that it exists. David Williams, so the Chief Medical Officer of Health for the province, he's talked about getting numbers lower. He did mention the other day numbers in the range of 100 to 150 cases per 100,000 people per week as sort of a measure. But when we followed up on that, we didn't really get any more clarity on that. It's hard to know what metrics they are using. So they want the buy-in of the local public health unit. So fine. But in terms of numbers, we don't know. Because if you look at some of the boards that are going back on Monday, for example, Niagara Region is in there. Well, it has more cases per week per 100,000 people than York, which is not going back till after Family Day. So maybe that was a case where the public health unit felt they wanted the extra time. Again, it's really not clear. And that is the one thing people have been asking. We were asking the education minister about that yesterday. What is it that will trigger another shutdown? What are the metrics? The public officer of health in Toronto was asked that as well. Eileen Davila also did not answer. So we don't really know.
I know you're covering this. I know you're talking to everybody behind the scenes. Is there something in particular that this government really wrestled with in terms of making this decision?
I mean, there's a lot of pressure. If you look at public polling, people are quite mixed on should kids go back or shouldn't they? And certainly when I was talking to people yesterday, I found that, a lot of students are very happy to get back. Parents are too, because, as you know, it's a huge load for parents to have their kids at home and also be working from home or have their kids supervised while they go out to work. So I think there are a lot of pressures. There's pressures from different public health units to go back as well. I know in Ottawa, which went back this Monday, the public health unit there was very vocal about the fact that they wanted kids back in school. So I think it's sort of these competing pressures. It's the safety versus, parents wanting, some parents not wanting, and just kind of trying to figure that all out. And of course, you throw in the mix this new variant, which nobody really knows what the result of that is going to be, or variants actually. So again, it's not an easy situation. And I think, again, it was just the competing interests that they had to deal with.
Okay, you mentioned it a little bit. You've talked to some of the stakeholders. What's the reaction so far?
I think everybody wants kids back in school. They realize that's the best place for them, in person, in school, with their friends and their teachers. But if you talk to the teacher unions, for example, they will talk about class sizes. They want small classes. They want classes of 15 in a traditional classroom because that allows for the physical distancing of up to 2 meters. And I think especially with the new variant, which is apparently much more contagious and much faster, that they feel that this would be safer. They also want more portable air filters for classrooms, because if you look in a board like Toronto, for example, a lot of the schools are really old. Some windows don't open. Some of the ventilation is pretty poor. So they're concerned about that as well. It's the class size issue that I think really is the one that resonates for teachers.
We'll be right back. Leading up to this announcement, you did some reporting, and the province announced a few steps that I actually think were some good moves that actually looked like they're getting a little bit creative with this. The one was fast-tracking teaching students and getting them into schools to help with the shortages. And then the other thing is obviously more money for ventilation. Let's talk a little bit about those. And am I wrong in thinking they feel a little bit late, like we are 10 months into this thing? Or should we just be glad that they're coming now?
I mean, some people were saying this is the kind of planning they should have done a year ago, right? Or 6 months ago. This is what should have happened. There is a shortage of teachers, according to the Ontario College of Teachers, and most boards I speak with say that they've had a hard time finding teachers because they've got the competing demands of virtual learning, the online learning, and in class, and then they have to cover teacher absences. So many boards are struggling. The Dufferin Peel Catholic Board, for example, is apparently reporting 40% absences that they're trying to cover. It's a difficult situation for the boards. Up north, I've spoken to a couple of education directors up there. They are having a really hard time. There's one board up there that's actually hiring unqualified teachers. So people who might have subject area expertise. So maybe you've got a math degree, but you're not a teacher, but they hire you to supply teach. That's how desperate they are. So the issue with teachers, I mean, that is actually a very creative solution. The faculties of ed were, happy to help accommodate that as well. So this will be students in their second or final year of teacher education program who can actually supply teach. They'll be paid as a regular, a new beginning teacher would be. And they can maybe help alleviate a bit of the crunch that boards are feeling. Those days will count as practicum or, practical experience days for them. And the schools are going to help accommodate them as well. That'll bring probably a couple of extra 2,000 teachers into the system. That's what the province predicts anyway. And I think boards were pretty happy to hear that.
What about the ventilation stuff? I mean, there's been some stuff talking about how this is actual federal money versus provincial, but I mean, is this actually going to get into schools now?
So the issue with ventilation is that we're looking at things like portable air filters, because if you look at, reforming, upgrading, renovating ventilation systems, that takes a lot of planning, like months of planning, and then to actually get it done, many more months. So that can't be done in the short term. So typically they're looking at portable air filters for schools. And I think the Elementary Teachers Union is looking for an air purifier in every classroom. That's sort of the standard that they've set. That is the ventilation issue. Again, some schools are old, some aren't, some have good ventilation, some don't, but it's a huge undertaking, to actually fix a ventilation system. So that is, yes, definitely one of the concerns that has been raised. repeatedly. And honestly, when I hear from teachers, it's always class size and ventilation. Those are the two things.
Okay, you actually brought up hiring, and I want to get back to that because yesterday I was listening to Minister Lecce, and in one of his answers, I believe he said something that if we had smaller class sizes, we'd need like 35,000 teachers, and they're having trouble finding 3,000 or 4,000. He also mentioned more janitors. Now, all this hiring, is this happening now? Can this happen in this school year, or is this really more for next year?
So boards have already done a bit of hiring of teachers and of custodians. When Minister Lecce talks about funding, he'll often throw around the $1.6 billion figure that the government spent on COVID efforts. So that's partly provincial, partly federal, and it's also partly some of board's own reserves. And they're using that to typically in Toronto and other large urban areas, they want smaller classes in sort of the hotspots in the region. So if you look in Toronto, for example, the Northwest End, you see a lot more teaching resources up there so that classes can be the 15 or smaller. That's really seen as ideal by the unions. In general, though, class sizes may have come down slightly. A lot of that's because kids are learning at home and not for any other reason. When he's talking about the hiring, the 35,000 teachers, I think he's referring to the fact that if we were to have all classes go to this smaller 15 size or much smaller than they are, that's what it would require. And those teachers aren't available. As I said, boards are struggling to find even occasional teachers for supply duties. So to find other teachers would be pretty difficult. And if you look at, for example, French language boards, French language classrooms, there are no French teachers around. The second one of them graduates, they get jobs right away. There's a huge shortage there. And the Toronto District School Board in particular has had trouble finding French teachers.
The other thing that they've mentioned is that rapid testing is going to start to really play a role here. But are we sure when that's going to come into play? And the other thing is what's that going to look like? I know it's not universal and it's voluntary. Is that right? It's not actually going to be mandated anywhere, is it?
No, it's all voluntary. The government started rolling this out in November, and they did it in some of the hotspots. So Toronto had some. And no, it's not every student and it's not every school. Education Minister Stephen Lecce has suggested that he's going to sort of leave it up to local public units of health to decide, to determine what kind of testing they're going to do where, like what schools. Typically, though, it's going to be in hotspots or areas where there's going to be outbreaks. When it's fully up and running, it'll be 50,000 tests across the province per week. Some people are going to say that's not enough. That's not nearly enough when you've got a couple million students, not all of them in school, but 50,000 may not seem like enough for across the province. The Star's May Warren and Maria Saru did a story earlier this week about testing and how it was supposed to ramp up in the northern boards, which have been open for a couple of weeks now. And really, they only found it in the Sudbury area. There's only a few schools that had it. So the rollout is a little bit slower, I think, than most people would like, given that kids are going back. And now, of course, with the variant, I think a lot of people are hoping that this voluntary testing is going to be one thing that can help mitigate any issues that may arise because of that.
Perfect segue. You led me to my next question.
You're welcome.
Well, all we keep hearing is the big X factor of these new variants and that they're just so much more contagious.
We have the addition of the rapid PCR testing for any positive cases that'll be vetted through to look to see if it's one of the variants. That's another question in the mind of the public. Is it something we're going to see? We want to make sure we're not going to assume it's not there. Let's go on the pretense it might be, but we want to catch it early and be aware of that. So all these are new checks and balances in place, even as our numbers are now slightly better than they were just before we went into the seasonal break at Christmas.
I didn't think I heard any sort of actual plan if there is an outbreak caused by one of these things, and if it does sort of run through a school. Basically, are we looking at a quick shutdown, really? Is there any sort of plan if the variant takes hold in a school?
We don't know. We didn't hear that yesterday. We don't know. We can look to other jurisdictions, for example, France, where they've said if there's even one case with a variant, classes shut down and things like that. They're also mandating a lot stricter physical distancing to keep the 2 meters in place. We're not hearing that here. I think the thinking is with the asymptomatic testing that they will pick up outbreaks and then, cohorts are shut down and whatnot. But in terms of the variant, no, we've heard very little about if there's a specific plan to deal with that should it start arising in schools.
I know it's absolutely important to get the kids back in school, but as a parent who kind of feels like my kid is on a yo-yo here, am I being a realist or a pessimist when I say I doubt we're actually going to get through the year without a disruption? What do you think?
Personally, I would be surprised if we get through the year without a disruption. I really do, especially with the new variants. But that said, the hope is that when kids go back, the numbers are low enough that it's not sort of a yo-yo. It's not an open up shutdown. But, we look at the UK, other areas where this has happened. On the flip side, Ontario is the only province in Canada where kids weren't back fully in school. So it's hard to say, but I can't imagine that we will have a trouble-free rest of the year, but we'll see. I hope I'm wrong.
How are your kids doing? You said you got 3. Are they in the house right now?
Yes,
Are they all in? And
they are in the house right now.
I know I'm talking to you in your bedroom.
Yes.
And how is it going in your household?
So my one daughter's home from university. She is in her first year and she was living in residence, but came home for the holidays. And then because of the stay-at-home order has stayed. And I have twins, they're in grade 11. So they're doing okay with the online learning. They actually like it. With it now, they have to sign on every morning. There's actually live online learning. They really like that. I think the quadmester system is difficult for them though, because it's a lot of learning crammed into a short period of time. I think that's what I would say is the one thing. My daughter had bio and chem this quadmester, which was a really huge workload. My son gets a break next quad. He's got parenting and gym. So he gets a break, but
I have to give a little bit of credit in that my daughter is 9 and she's in grade 4. And I do think that this round of virtual school has been just so much better than last year. But don't get me wrong, as I said before, can't wait till she goes back to school for at least a little bit, just for more social interaction. And she needs to be there for her development. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think that our listeners should know?
Well, I guess the one thing, is just to make sure there's a lot of new screening protocols for school for kids going in. They're trying to encourage staff not to congregate in between or after classes. They're trying to encourage kids not to do the same. So I think that's maybe one thing as a parent that you could be doing. Make sure that your kids aren't playing with other kids after school. If they're being cohorted throughout the day, try and keep those distance from other friends. I know it's difficult and it's a long slog. And I know that for my own teenagers, they're itching to go out and see their friends. But, we're trying to keep a lid on it for the greater good in the hopes that this passes quickly and we can all get back to normal life. And I think that's the one thing that when I spoke to students yesterday, they were saying, it's just, if everybody does their part, they're going to keep us safe and we'll get through this. So that's the one message that I think, I've heard and would pass on.
Well, Kris, it's fantastic for us. I completely agree. Getting them back to school at least gives them a bit of a normal life, which I think is what we all really, really want. Kris, I really, really want to thank you for your time, and I'm sure we'll be talking again before the school year's out. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rishu.
Kris Rushowy is a reporter in the Queen's Park Bureau for The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Rajin Budler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisas. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Foso. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.